The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Just a quick housekeeping. We have the PASS Summit 2018 registration offer for our specific business intelligence virtual group. We have a promo code for first-time attendees. We'll get 200 hours of, recordings from last year's. Here, the code is below. Oops, below right here when you register. All right, it's 12 o'clock. We have Ginger Grant today presenting. She's been awarded the MVP in data platform since 2016. And today she'll be presenting Power BI practical storytelling and visualization techniques. Without wasting any time, Ginger, I'll give you presenter.
Great, hold on. Am I presenter now?
Yeah, you are. You should be now. The floor is yours.
Okay. Come on. Hopefully you can see my screen. Hope.
Yep, we're good.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everybody for attending to PASS Virtual for Business Intelligence and Data Warehousing today. My name is Ginger Grant, and I'm going to be talking about Power BI, practical storytelling, and visualization. It's a little bit of the agenda for today. We're going to be talking about storytelling. The point of data is to provide information to give people the ability to see how their data is, and I'm going to be talking about some of the techniques for it. I had recently reviewed a few, and I thought some of them were kind of interesting, and some of them I think you might want to avoid. We'll be talking about color. I know that this is kind of one of those things that a lot of people think, oh shoot, I can't do that. Well, I look at it as like drawing. I can't necessarily draw, but I know how to trace, and color impact is a very important thing to know. And if you don't know it, there are websites that you can learn from and copy from, if the case may be. And then we're going to look at some before and after implementation techniques for how you might want to look at improving your Power BI reports. A little bit about me. I'm principal consultant of Desert Isle Group. I tweet way too much at Desert Isle SQL, and I have a blog with a bunch of Power BI topics and other stuff. And I am an MVP and a Microsoft certified trainer as well. So a little bit about data visualization. I figure I'd start with the oldest data visualization story known to man. This in 1954, there was a big cholera epidemic in London, and over 600 people died. And this was the first use of data visualization to help tell a story. And what the story really is kind of shown up in this blown up bit here. Little squares are marked where people died. And if you'll notice, a lot of people died right around here. Well, the reason, and on both sides of the street, people were dying right around it. Well, the original version of this map, it was done, and it didn't show a very important point. That when they had the first map, they didn't put the pump, which was right here in December 1854, he produced this map. And this map showed where the pump was, and they figured out, oh, well, shoot, I bet the number of deaths for cholera has everything to do with something wrong with this pump. And sure enough, this particular well was infected, and when they got rid of this pump handle, people stopped dying. So it's important to include all the relevant information in a visualization. This is kind of the first example of that. Because they're so busy interested in saying it didn't have anything to do with the sewers, they forgot to put information about the pump. So there's some more, visualizations now that we have better and more modern tools. It's now easier to, create visualizations. The one on the left is the previous one, and it's, a little blow up of it. So it gives you the ability to perhaps provide data visualization in a way that can really provide more information to people who are actually viewing it. And the goal of this is to kind of look to be able to see, things very quickly. The idea with visualizations is it shouldn't take forever to find out what the story is trying to tell you. So for example, if you look at this and you look at the number of deaths, this was a thing from Edward Tufte, that it tells you that there was, hardly any deaths, and then all of a sudden they got spiked. But what this particular graph does is it's additive, and that shows you that there was a whole bunch of deaths, but you really can't see where it tapered off because they did everything in a cumulative fashion. This is actually a more accurate visualization because it shows that they peaked and fell off. So it's, while the other one is technically correct, it doesn't show the impact of what days that they were, had the deaths occurred and when they started falling off, which is what this different visualization provides for you. So it's kind of important to remember that, especially in this situation where people were literally dying because they were trying to analyze the data. So when looking to process data through visualization, what you're trying to do is you're trying to tell something that's memorable. There was a study recently done at Stanford, and they provided information to people in different ways. And they found that if they told people a story, 63% of them would remember the stories, but only 5% of people would remember a single statistics. So it's something to think about. If you want people to remember it, you need to be able to have it tell a story, because that's what catches people's attention. You also want it to be persuasive. You want to look at the information to provide it in a way that, provides the information in a way that will help be persuasive. I will caution you on that though, because a lot of the time some of the data that you are providing people is going to be data that they are going to be doing analysis on. So a lot of times when you look at, providing a narrative and being persuasive, you already have a story in mind and are looking to have the visual reinforce your story. And if you look at various books that are about data visualization, Alberto Cairo, and he's got a book that's basically, they have the story and the data is supposed to illustrate what the story says, which is kind of different than what you might create in Power BI, where you want people to engage and perhaps come up with their own stories. And so you might want to stay away from people like Cairo or Cole Nussbaum, who are basically trying to use data just to persuade rather than to explain. So keep that in mind when you're looking at your visualizations, because the whole key here is to engage. One of the reasons that people use Power BI as a tool instead of some other tools is because it allows people to interactively look at the data and analyze it themselves. I know a lot of times when, as a professional with data, I don't necessarily have all of the knowledge that's available about all the data. I know a lot of different things, and they aren't all necessarily why, the numbers for a given division, what their current value should be. So that kind of information is left to the subject matter experts. And sometimes some of the numbers that I think are most important, if you talk to the users, they're not. So make sure to temper what you're doing with, the knowledge of the people who work every day with the data. If that doesn't include you, you want to include the opinions of those who are. There are a number of different, processing data through visual tactics right now. While it has been a really big push when it comes to everybody creating their own visualizations, there's kind of two schools of thought in that. For one, generally speaking, if you are doing financial reports for the executives the executives aren't the ones who are doing that. So they still want people to do visualizations for them. And the other thing that is commonly done in this industry is that you would, as a data professional, perhaps guide people, do a couple of sample reports, and then hopefully, because Power BI is a tool that people can be, instruct themselves with or learn with relatively quickly once the data model's in place, have other people follow your models and then use them to create their own reports. That may be something that you do as well, and that kind of gets into engagement. A lot of times when Power BI is first introduced into an environment, it's a bit of a sales effort to get people to want to use it, and to provide examples that are as most engaging as possible is definitely a way that you can do that. Now, one of the things that needs to be tempered with this is making sure that your data model supports it. So prior to creating visualizations, you need to know the kinds of things that people are going to want to do to make sure that the underlying model can support it, and if not, of course, make the necessary adjustments so that it can. So some of the data visualization concepts: you want to aggregate when necessary, especially when you're talking about doing it in DAX. I know that a lot of people try to do aggregations on the fly if you are providing a model to a number of people, or if a number of people are doing the same model. If everybody is creating an aggregation, then it may or may not be done the same way. So put those in DAX and put them in the model whenever you can. Watch the axis values. If you don't necessarily have to set them to 0. You want to look at including relevant data, but not including data that doesn't matter. Avoid what's called, magic, because you just don't want to throw a whole bunch of things out there just to see what sticks. You want to provide a focus to what you're trying to show, what you're trying to analyze. The other thing I would also caution you on is don't necessarily throw everything on one page. Hey, you've got multiple places to put visualizations. You put dashboards, you can do them in reports. However you choose to do it, you don't have to have everything on one screen. And chances are people don't like them. People may not like them in the order that you have laid them out, so they'll create their own dashboards with the reports you create anyway. So one thing that I definitely wanted to address, because I've heard this from a number of people, and people just don't understand why pie charts are bad. And I've actually heard people make up some very interesting results that have very interesting answers for why pie charts are bad that have nothing to do with reality. So I figured I would address that right now. So the reason that the pie charts are bad, because it's very difficult to see angles very well. Humans just aren't really good at discerning angles, which means that if you look at this section of the pie chart, it's kind of difficult to see which one of these is bigger or smaller. Is EFD actually a lot bigger than UL-NGL? I'm not really sure. This is for the European Parliament parties. It's not easy to tell, and that's just because the human eye can't discern angles. And there's really nothing to be done about fixing the human eye. So this is generally something that people are not going to be able to look at very quickly and determine which is the highest value, or which is the ones that are, comparable in value. And the only thing worse than a pie chart is a 3D pie chart, which makes it even worse. If you look at this particular angle, it's, these two look to be the same size, and so it's the only thing that's worse than a pie chart is a 3D pie chart. Instead, if you look at the data another way, this is very easy to determine whether or not which one is the largest group and how the other ones rank. So we can see what the differences are between UGL and EFD, and looking at how they stack up. One thing that I also wanted to talk about for data visualization is that just because Power BI has a whole bunch of different controls, you don't get any extra points for using them all. As a matter of fact, it's not necessary to use them. I have created reports where all I did was column charts and bar charts, because the purpose isn't a exercise as to how many cool visualizations you can put in a report. The idea is for people to understand them and to provide the data in which they find comfortable doing it, not necessarily to push the envelope by teaching people how to read a fish chart. So I encourage you to use charts that make sense to people and that follow various valuable design constraints so that they convey meaning. One thing too is that you want people to be able to ascertain the data quickly. For example, if I had in this particular chart color coded each bar in a different color, by the way, that's relatively difficult to do in Power BI, but there's a good reason for that. It takes the eye longer to look at color in a certain range and then determine which one is greater. So you are better off if you are doing a column chart or you are doing a bar chart if all of your bars or columns are the same color, because trying to discern meaning based on groups in a bar chart is just not something that your eye is easy to do, and you can convey the information faster if everything in a given chart is one color. So just keep that in mind. Another thing that you want to remember when looking to lay out a report is this is a common diagram that's used by people who do layouts, like magazine graphic designers or web designers. And this is based on how the human eye reads. Well, here on the West, we read from left to right. So that's how people tend to look at data if it is on a report. So the most important data is supposed to be in the top left-hand corner. So the top left-hand corner should be the least likely place that you should put something like a company logo, any kind of a slicer or any other kind of selector. That's where your most important information needs to go. So don't put the title up there, don't put a slicer up there, put like a KPI that conveys a lot of value in that top left-hand corner. And then kind of work your way from left to right. And if you want things to really not be very memorable, put them around here. If you want to bury something, that would be the place to do it. Generally speaking, if I get asked this a lot, well, where should I put my slicers? Generally speaking, a good spot for them would be here on the right, kind of lower right would be better. If you could stick them at the bottom, that wouldn't be a bad thing either. Keeping the left-hand side, because your eye is drawn to this first for your more important information. The other thing too is that people are used to things appearing in an organized fashion. So yes, you do want to organize things both horizontally and vertically, line things up. I'm not a huge fan of the grid for doing this. I actually, because unfortunately, unlike some other applications, in my mind, the grid is not granular enough. It's too big and doesn't help me when aligning things up. Because there's too much space between the grid. What I do is I will default to looking at the actual values. And if I look at the actual values, then I can definitely see if something is lined up. Just make sure that you do that. Attention to detail will make people think differently of your report. They will think better of it if you have bothered to line things up. All right, for dashboard layout, choose the correct control. What's the correct control? Well, there are a number of different guidelines that you can use with that. For example, if you have a line chart and you're looking at progression over time, generally speaking, the bottom axis should be date. If you are comparing a bunch of different product categories, you do not want to have a line chart. That doesn't convey as much value because it's showing data points and people are going to make connections that aren't necessarily there. You want to use proportionally sized controls. You want to make sure that things have perspective and the perspectives are relevant. When you are presenting data, don't sort it alphabetically. That doesn't provide any value. Instead, do something like sort it based on highest to lowest or by quarter. Look at your data, look at how you can sort it, and look at how it can provide more meaning. be consistent into where you add slicers. If you have determined that for your company or for your organizations that all the slicers are going to be on the bottom of the screen, put them on the bottom of the screen all the time. Develop standards internally and keep on using them. The purpose for this is you do not want to make reports difficult for people to understand. Again, the whole purpose of creating a data visualization is to provide information in a way that people very quickly determine what the report is trying to tell them, so they can determine whether or not they want to do some more analysis on the report, or what they need to do. So you're giving people information that they're going to be using. Don't make them have to work very hard to find it. I will add backgrounds. When I say backgrounds, I mean colors. I do not mean a noisy picture in the background, because that can distract from the data, and that's definitely not something that you want to do. Something other than white provides a more a report that makes the graphics pop more, allows you to use different groupings, and is generally something that you want to do just to show people you know a little bit about Power BI. Make sure that you change one of the first things I do when I create a report is I go and change the background. It's really easy to do, and it gives it a better look. It goes from I just learned this in dashboard in a day to I actually know what I'm doing. So let's talk about color. I know that there are people who are very bad at this. I know people whose spouses pick out their clothing, and that's probably a good thing. And I admit that I am not the best person who knows everything about color, but I do know where I can go look. And one of the places that that you should go look is here at Color Adobe. You do not want to have, this isn't Skittles. You don't get to all the color. You don't get extra points for all the colors in the rainbow. No more than 6 colors as a rule. And that's kind of pushing it. And when you use colors, the colors should be meaningful. One thing I will also caution you against is not using red and green. There are a number of different reasons for this. The big one being that approximately 7% of the U.S. male population is colorblind, so they're not going to be able to see what you're telling them. And the other reason for not using red and green is it's a very ingrained visual. I mean, from the time people were very small, they've been taught, green is go, green is good, red is bad. So if you have those colors, people will automatically associate, bad and good, and then they won't even look at the detail anymore. So generally speaking, avoid using red and green in combination. The other thing that I will encourage you to do is don't use the default colors. I don't know what possessed Microsoft to come up with the color palette that is default in Power BI. I think it's just to show people to see if they know how to change the color scheme, because it's generally something that you're going to want to do. The color palette that's by default is not, generally speaking, an optimal one. If you go through and pick every single color, it's very difficult to maintain. So if you use a template, it is much easier to pick the colors and then use a selected list of colors rather than having to go in each and every time. Oh, by the way, if you don't use a template and you later on decide that you want to, and you've already selected all the colors, then the template won't override what you've already selected. So it's best to start off with a template. And then if you don't like those colors, then change the template rather than go in and change every single color. There is a great tool for that, which Mike Carlo and Seth Bauer at Power BI Tooltips have put together. So I want to take a look at that. If you are unfamiliar with Power BI templates, then you can do that. Oh, as a little tip, if you are using Power BI Report Server, you may notice that you do not have the ability to use color templates, because it's considered a preview feature, because they haven't created a really cool interface yet. But if you are generating reports for Power BI Report Server, take your report, read it into regular Power BI, add the template, and then use the Power BI version for report server, and it'll automatically use your template for you. So even if you're not using, if you're using Power BI report server, you can still use templates. Keep in mind also the different color blindness in printing. I was speaking at a SQL Saturday not too long ago, and I was noticing two people were in the corner talking, and one of them turned her monitor towards the other guy and said, "Hey, Kevin, does this look good?" And I asked, I said, "So is Kevin colorblind?" She said, "Yes, he is." And it's much faster to have him look at it to see whether or not the report is color sensitive. So that's something that if you don't happen to have a colorblind person lying around, and most of us don't, there are websites for this. And we'll take a look at that website really quickly. You can look at pasting a picture. There's some other ones that are a little bit more informal to take a look at what a colorblind person is seeing, so that you can ensure that what you are developing is something that they can actually see. The other thing that I will, in addition to people being colorblind, believe it or not, there are people who love to print reports, and many of them tend to be higher level executives or people who are very worried about security. So don't think that, oh, it's Power BI, no one's ever going to print this. That may not be true, and you might want to just print something to make sure that you can tell the difference in the color contrasts if somebody prints it out on a black and white printer, because let's face it, black and white printers are still the workhorses of the industry. So a little bit about fonts. Use the right font. What's the right font? Well, it's a consistent font that matches what you're trying to tell people. They convey meaning. The first one on the left is obviously a Western font, and the one on the right looks like I'm trying to kill someone. So you want to keep that in mind, picking fonts. I would stay away from fonts that draw a lot of reaction, like Comic Sans. You may also want to use fonts that complement any and all logos that you have. Make sure that there is a difference between a serif and a sans serif font. You'll notice here where it says gender and ethnicity, this is considered a serif font because it's kind of got little curlicues. And if you look at all the rest of the text, it's a sans serif. So if don't do this, if you are picking a font, unless you don't want to go with a one that in a company logo, like they didn't choose to use this one here, it would be best to match the logo in terms of serif and non-serif. So it would be best for this one to pick sans serif, a sans serif font. Several examples of those are things like Arial, Segoe UI or Segoe Lite. And if you're talking about serif fonts, Times New Roman is, of course, the most popular one of those. Also look at the font sizes. Don't get crazy with font sizes. Yes, they should be different, but only use 4. The other thing too is that you never know who is going to be displaying your report on a projector. So don't necessarily size it for a screen. I wouldn't make anything smaller than, I don't do 10. Very rare, it makes things easy for people to see, and I like a lot of room on the page, so I never do anything that is smaller than 10. I think the default size of 8 is too small. The other thing that you want to think about is color contrast. I know that a lot of titles in Power BI come out as gray. A lot of people have difficulty seeing that against different backgrounds, so you're probably going to want to change it from gray to something more like black or a dark blue, something with more contrast. So instead of this font here, I'm going to change this to something that matches in terms of a serif. Okay, we've talked about a number of different concepts with visualization, and I thought it might be best to not only talk about it, but to actually do it. So I'm going to take a report and I'm going to walk you through some steps for what's wrong with it and what we can do to make it better. So this is my before report. You'll notice there's a bunch of things that are wrong with it. It uses, you know, some different fonts within it. It's using the Power BI default color scheme. It doesn't have a title. It uses page one. If you have these tabs, since you have them, they always should be used to convey meaning. You know, do not let people just guess at what that is. Always put a title in there. There's no focal point. You can't tell what the people are trying to show. The icon for the company logo is in a weird place, and it's fuzzy. People get really uptight about that. Make sure you have a nice company logo, and if you don't know where one is, talk to somebody in your marketing department, or look online for something that doesn't look like you pasted it with Vaseline on it. There's no easy method in this report for filtering anything. So if you want, it's not obvious with anybody who receives it how they could possibly interact with it. Some of these visualizations don't even have any titles. So what are you trying to show? If you look at the data, there's a whole bunch of data. Generally speaking, nobody cares about data that's that old. They would rather see data that is closer to what's actually going on in terms of years. So if you have old data, you really want to ensure that it's not necessarily the default, or if it's being used so that people focus on data that's more relevant to them. The other thing, just to kind of critique this report, is notice I have a line chart here, but my line chart has individual products on the bottom, which doesn't make, by manufacturers rather. Well, that doesn't make any sense, because you are going to draw a line between these, and there really isn't a line. I mean, this particular vendor has a volume of 3,000, and this has a volume of 14,000. So it would be better to compare these rather than have them on a line chart, because you're drawing it that it goes up and down, and technically it's just what they're providing, so don't want to necessarily go with that. This is also probably too busy. There's a number of different visualizations on this one page. I would recommend busting this up and grouping things in a method that makes sense to somebody who's actually using it. This wheel chart, I don't understand what this is telling me. There's no title, and all this comparative stuff. This has got two different, you know, it's got red, and I don't understand why these are red and why this one will be black. So this is terribly confusing to me. If you are given a report like that and you can't make sense out of what the visualization is telling you, chances are you're not the only one. So in this instance, unless I could talk to the person who created this, I would probably get rid of this and then, you know, revisit providing a visualization that actually has meaning. The other thing that you might notice about this particular report is everything is crammed onto the very edges. This is not, generally speaking, a good design constraint, because there's people react better if there is space around it. People are actually looking for margins. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at fixing all the problems that are wrong with this to make this a report that will read better and will look better. So first thing I'm going to do what I was talking about. I'm going to go ahead and I am going to insert a line. And the reason that I'm going to do this is not because I want this line or I think this line is particularly attractive. It's because I want to create a margin. And if I use a line, I can use this for my margin and use it to kind of guide me into where to put things. And this in my world works a lot better than the grid. So what I'm going to do, and it also lets me know that I'm not done with this report. This is in draft mode because it's got these lines in there. And I'm just going to use them as guides, and I want everything to be on the other side of this line. I'm going to go ahead and just use this as a design guide. Okay. Oops. There we go. So this is, I'm going to want everything inside of these lines. All right, the next thing I wanted to look at is I wanted to kind of bring in some of the stuff that we talked about earlier and take a look at the color theme and color theme generator. Now, one thing about the color themes, if you look at them in Power BI, what you get when you are generating, let me pull that up here real quick, is you get a JSON file. And JSON files are not particularly easy to read. And I will be using this one, and that looks something like this. To a normal human, I have no idea what this is. So that's what I use things like Adobe for. So if I wanted to know what the heck is that color, I can go in here and I can type it. Oops, helps if I do it right. And it'll change it for me. Now, there are a number of different, if I have no clue as to what to pick to colors, one good rule of thumb is to use colors that are complementary to the logo in our report screen. So having a bunch of different shades of green isn't a bad idea. The other thing too is that different monitors convey colors differently. If you are going to be presenting, you want to make sure that it looks good on the presenter in, say, the conference room at your office. Personally, I would think that you'd want to change something around in here because these two don't provide enough contrast and people may have enough difficult seeing. But there's different color types that you could possibly pick. And we'll notice that when we pick these colors are picked for us using the various things that we have here. What we can do if we like, the shaded color scheme, something similar to this, what we could do then is we could go to the Power BI Advanced Color Theme Generator. And what we can do here is start give this a name. So actually, I'm going to call this one. And this will provide all of the colors for us. So I could do something like, as a background color, I want this and a foreground. And also I have the ability to actually, pick something too. So it will provide the color for me. I think you're going to get better colors if you do something like this rather than that. And once I have, entered the colors that I want, notice it's creating this output file, and this is what my JSON file needs to look like. So I can go ahead and use this and generate the JSON file that I'm going to be using in my Power BI report. So I go back to my Power BI report, and I can just go to Switch Theme, import a theme, and this is the .json file. I'm going to go ahead and say open. And notice it changed all the color for me. Now, it didn't change all the colors because somebody's gone in here and they changed the colors prior to me touching it. So I'm going to have to go through and manually do that. But that's okay because I'm not sure that I'm going to want to keep every single report I've got here because this is a lot of information. So I can tell you right now that one thing that I want to do is I want to get rid of this because this doesn't tell me anything and I can't figure out what it's doing. So I'm going to make that go away. The other thing, I'm going to see if I could scale this. Oh yeah, so that I have a company logo that I could actually use, and that one's fine. If you're using a colored background like I am here, it's very important to have to know what you're wanting to do in terms of aesthetics. I have created reports where I have made all of the reports themselves white, and then in that case it wouldn't matter if this had a white background as well because it really makes them pop against the background. That's definitely one design that you could possibly use, but see if you want to have a transparent one or not. I would never pick a something that's really busy for my background because then it detracts from the graphics. But I also want to make sure that I go ahead and put a title on this. So I'm going to put a text box. Well, I remember this. Sure I am. Come on. And here we go. And let's see. Oops. My typing skills are obviously awesome. Oops. And these are key funding values. The other thing too is if you're doing a report for somebody else, you may not, you need to keep in mind who you're doing it for and ask them what makes meaning for them, because sometimes that's not something that you would necessarily know. And what I like to do with reports when I create them is change the tab as well, so that it matches, so that if you have a number of tabs, you know which one you're working on. These are I think these are KPIs, but they're very difficult to tell, so I'm going to go ahead and fix them by making them cards. Rather than whatever the heck they were. Now, this is an interesting thing regarding the numbers. There's two schools of thought when it comes to numbers. Some people prefer to see them in whatever auto format is fine, but I have had very picky users and they would prefer to see things in the same scale. So if I have this in thousands, then this should be in thousands, even though it's a larger number. Generally speaking, these are set to auto, but you can, of course, change your, which is what is set here, but you can change your data label so that it'll be consistent. So if I wanted this to be thousands and I wanted to make sure that this was thousands, I would set them both so that they would always show up as thousands. You'll want to know whether or not you want to use a decimal point, and if so, kind of be consistent. This one has 2. We may want to instead change the decimal, again, set to auto, to 1. But keep in mind that's something that you want to get with your users on to determine what makes sense. The other thing too is this title is kind of lost. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and change this to black to provide more contrast. And now that I've changed this, I probably want to make this a little bit bigger and start getting consistent with this. So let's see what size this should probably be. And I'm going to go ahead and change this to, I'm going to change this to 175 and make the height, 175. And then make this 100. Kind of make it, and then once I've got my format here, I can apply it. Oops, it's probably more than I wanted to do there. I'm going to go back and change this to auto from thousands. Go back to 1. Problem when you do formatting, does it too much? Make sure that this is the appropriate size. This is 100. And I would encourage you to make sure that you have all these set. I have also worked for a number of people that were just sure that, oh, those are different, and they weren't. To make things equally formatted, go ahead and click on the distribute, select horizontally, and that's still probably not going to be enough, so I'm going to want to kind of spread these out and do distribute horizontally. Oops. Put that back. And this will provide balance. And then for alignment, I'm going to align at the top. And that way I know things are automatically aligned for me. So use the tools when you can. So for this particular visualization, I think I've got too much on this screen. I want to make this also something that provides a little bit more value, because I've got a line chart, but I've got manufacturers here. So I'm going to change this chart a little bit to provide more meaning. And I'm going to want to change the x-axis value from manufacturer. And I'm going to go ahead and change that to month year. And that way my line chart makes sense, because you can see it over time. I've got a number of different things on here. that I'm showing here, but it's showing it over time, which gives people a better method of doing it. But there's quite a lot of data here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this particular visualization, and I'm going to put it on another, and just for the purposes of this example, I'm going to get rid of it. Generally speaking, I would put that on another page so that it would be available. And I'll make this so that you can see it better by stretching it out. And I want to make sure that I'm not screwing up my visuals, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now, one thing that I mentioned before that I wasn't able to do very easily is I didn't have a way of interacting with the data very much. So I'm going to actually go ahead and create just a simple year here as a pick list, and I'm actually going to do something a little bit different, and I'm going to make it as a grid. Boy, this is a lot of data, and I'm going to do a report level filter on this because it just seems to be like there's just an awful lot of years that are available here, and I don't have all that for here as well. So I'm going to go ahead and change my report level filter so that my year is greater than, and I'm just going to do greater than 2012. And that way it decreases the amount of information I'm showing, allowing people to see the most relevant information. Area charts tend to be not terribly useful in terms of providing information to people. So I'm going to change this to a clustered column chart. And these are the default values that showed up in the, I'll make this go away. Default values that showed up in the grid. I'm not necessarily crazy about them. So I'm actually going to just change that yellow one to something prettier. Might want to go ahead and change the template so I don't have that color. And then I'm going to change these colors because you'll notice that somebody else had done that before, and now it's not matching my template. So I'm going to go in and to my data colors, and I'm going to pick the template colors instead. So that way it's a more consistent look and feel. The other thing too is notice that some of these are quite small. So I want to go ahead and look at my titles here and change these fonts to black, and the text size, I'm going to make these 10. That's too small. I make them 12. Notice by default, the font is set to Segoe UI. If you are going to change that, you're going to need to be changing it everywhere. So just keep that in mind when you're changing it. And to be consistent, I want to make sure that all of my, oops. All of my fonts are black and 12 to be consistent with my visualizations. And making sure these are lined up appropriately with my, again, these two are different sizes, so I want to make sure that I am giving them the same size. Looking at size of this one. Oops. And the size of this one needs to go ahead and make these the same size, and this is also needs to be further over and down, and positioning them so that they are the same. Now, I know that people say yes, but we're only going to put this on a dashboard. Depends on how your people are going to be visualizing your reports. They may or may not be looking into the dashboard. You should always make sure that you provide them so no matter how they look at it, it will be in a decent visualization for that. There. So I'm consistent. Oops, I noticed that this is not the appropriate font. And then get rid of my, one thing I didn't do. I want to make sure I set my page background. Oops, that's not what I was thinking of. Probably something like that. And then moving this kind of so it's underneath. And this is a report. You can get rid of these lines. And I now have a report that's much easier to read the information on, provides more information, it's a lot cleaner. We can see what it's for, and it also provides people a very easy way of selecting data. So this is the kind of thing you want to take a look at when you're creating reports, is how you can do it, how you can use these kind of layout skills to improve the use and visualization of your reports. Okay, so today we talked a little bit about visualizing data. We reviewed some design concepts. We talked about that quadrant system and provided you some references for color selection, making good choices, and also the schema tool. We looked at font selection, and then we implemented everything we talked about by redoing a report. So with that, are there any questions about what I talked about today?
Ginger, there's a couple questions
Sure.
guess I could ask and you can answer. Is there a way to tell what changes have been made to a chart or report so you can tell what another person has done that is not default?
No, you have to just go look, unfortunately.
Okay.
There's no easy way of going to find that out.
All right. How about the overlaying visuals? Should you always make the borders of the visuals not overlay because of click behavior?
I would say generally speaking, but that's a good rule, but not all the time, because when it comes to things like graphics you might be able to get away with it.
Okay.
Or titles.
All right. Also, they had can you use TFS for source control of it?
While you can use TFS, it's not going to show you things like, oh, somebody changed the font on the fifth tab or something like that. It just shows you that it has been changed and locked in, locked out. And yes, and if you don't have TFS, you could also use SharePoint Online, which will also allow you to do version control. So I would highly recommend you using it, especially when you're working with people.
Okay. Is there an equivalent to style sheets or some way to auto-define size and font settings, etc.?
Not like style sheets, unfortunately. I wish.
Yeah, this presentation will be Ginger. You'll send us the slides, or you're gonna post it on your blog.
I'll post it on my site. Yeah.
Okay. And everyone, also, this is being recorded as well, and we'll upload it to our YouTube page, which you can find on bi.pass.org. If anyone has any further questions, you can enter them in the questions tab, and then I can save the questions log, and I'll send them to Ginger. And during her blog write-up, she'll try to answer as much as possible. Alrighty. Well, thank you so much, Ginger.
Thank you. Really appreciate you having me come speak.
Yeah. And thank you everyone for attending. Alrighty, well, that sums everything up.
Okay.
Alright, have a good one.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.